Okay, this is another webinar in our energy series, Ag Energy Management. It's brought to you by University of Wisconsin Extension, University of Wisconsin-Madison, the State Energy Office in Wisconsin. Also sponsored grant-wise by a grant from SARE, Sustainable Ag Education and Research, and one from Department of Energy. Today we're going to talk about life cycle analysis. We have Doug Reinemann, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in biological systems engineering, and he's going to give us little ABCs on life cycle analysis, what it is, shortcut is LCA, and some of the projects he's done looking at, he called it green cheese, but looking at the energy use and other issues with dairy production. So with that, I'll turn it over to Doug.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm just looking on the sidebar here and see that someone was getting an echo. We are using the telephone for the audio, as far as I know, not the Blackboard website. So if anyone needs help connecting up to the telephone, just type in a message and we'll try to get you connected. So I will assume that people can hear me and see the slides. And again, if someone's having trouble, just use the sidebar and let us know if we can help you. So our green cheese project started, I think, about 5 years ago or so. And we've had a number of people helping out in various different ways, looking at different parts of this complicated dairy and biofuels situation in Wisconsin. And we've got a website down there, so if you want some of the publications, more information, details, specific numbers, methods, those sorts of things, you can consult that website, and there's lots more where this came from. So just to put it into context, why has this become an issue? And what about life cycle assessment? Why has that become such a buzzword? And this slide really sort of summarizes the issue. The people who do retailing and marketing tell us that consumers are getting more interested in buying green products. So they want to have some assurance when they go to buy stuff that it's produced in a way that's responsible to the environment, responsible to animals, responsible to workers. And as indicated in this graph, this is particularly true when people go to buy food. So the people shopping for groceries, including, of course, milk, about 35% of those shoppers have a preference for a product that is perceived to be green. And that's really where life cycle assessment comes in. Life cycle assessment is sort of the standard measurement quantification protocol for sort of documenting, quantifying the environmental impacts of production of a good or a service. So, one of the sort of spin-offs on that is particularly Walmart has been sort of leading this. They want to develop a sort of a carbon footprint statement on the on the tag of every product. So when you go to buy a gallon of milk or a six-pack of beer or a pair of boots, you know how much carbon was emitted into the atmosphere for the production of that product. And I should say that, carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions has really been the primary environmental impact that people have been talking about, although its importance has kind of waned in the last few years, mainly because world economies have sort of crashed and people are sort of reconsidering whether or not they want to invest in reducing greenhouse gas emissions versus sort of just keeping world economies functioning. So to put the dairy industry in perspective, this was from an FAO report which really kind of launched the whole issue related to dairy production. The FAO estimated that the dairy industry in the world contributes about 4% of all the man-made greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So, on the one hand, 4% is a pretty small percentage. So if your goal were really to make a major impact on greenhouse gas emissions, dairy production systems aren't probably where you would start. So even if, for example, we could cut greenhouse gas emissions by 25%, that's a 1% reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions in the planet. So on the one hand, it's a small number, but on the other hand, everyone is trying to be responsible, and the dairy industry is trying to put on, a good face and say we are being responsible citizens, so we will also reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So right now, the sort of number is to produce a gallon of milk will emit something near 18 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere. So 2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of milk production. And one of the reasons that we call ourselves green cheese is because somewhere around 80% of the milk in Wisconsin goes into making cheese. And because you've got this sort of concentration, you get 1 pound of cheese for 10 pounds of milk, the carbon footprint of cheese sort of looks very high. So you get something like 8.8 kilograms of CO2 released per kilogram of cheese. So it can look like a very environmentally problematic product. And part of that has to do with the fact that cheese is a very concentrated nutritional product. There's a lot of calories, a lot of nutritional value, a lot of protein in cheese. So it looks, relatively high from a carbon footprint point of view if you do it on a weight basis. However, if you do it on a nutritional basis, it looks actually more comparable to other food products. So that's part of the whole marketing and information part of this, is to present these sort of numbers in some sort of context. So you can't really compare the carbon footprint of a pound of cheese to a gallon of Coke, because of course Coke is mostly water and doesn't have a lot of nutritional content. So when we get down to the brass tacks of doing a life cycle assessment, what we're trying to do is to account for all of the inputs that go into the production of a product. So we've got, we can sort of think about the production and processing. That's the sort of things that happen on the farm, in a processing plant. But we also want to account for all the raw materials that went into the system to enable us to produce that product. So, for example, we've got tractors, and we had to, dig some steel out of the ground, and that sort of gets amortized over the life of the tractor and the production of the milk. And we got some stainless steel that goes into the dairy plant. So we're accounting for back to sort of the beginning of the inputs to produce the product. Then we also want to look at the distribution. So we have to transport that milk and cheese, the milk to the cheese plant and the cheese to the consumer. So there's a transportation part of the system. And if you've heard about sort of the food miles issue. I mean, they're sort of concentrating on this little part of the life cycle, all the transportation to get the stuff from where it's made to where it's used. Then we have a use cycle. So in this case, for dairy products, the consumer is going to go to the store and buy some cheese and put it in the fridge, and so there's a certain amount of inputs to use the product, and also some outputs, some greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from the refrigerator. And then at the end, the final part of the life cycle is disposal, and in the case of dairy products, we're disposing of the packaging. So there's some environmental consequences to disposing of the packaging. Some of that might be recycled. So if it's our milk bottle, our plastic milk bottle, some of that might be recycled back to be reused. Some of, if in the case of a plastic cheese wrapper, that probably goes to a landfill. And the other interesting part about this is that when the DMI first did their study on the life cycle of milk, they figured that 1/3 of the milk that was produced went down the drain. And that seemed to me, when I first heard that number, I thought, oh, that can't be right, But, there have been a number of studies that really sort of follow how people buy and use and dispose of food, and this is a number that's pretty consistent across the entire food system. It's higher with perishable products, but, on average, about 1/4 to 1/3 of the food that we produce go to all that work and trouble to make a nice gallon of pure milk with no bacteria in it and all that nutrition value. About 1/3 of it goes down the drain. So I want to just kind of bring that up because we'll be talking about sort of where are the opportunities to make the system more efficient, and more efficient use of food, meaning that if people actually eat it rather than dump it down the drain or throw it in a trash can, is an enormous opportunity to improve the efficiency of the food production system. So when we're doing an LCA, what we are trying to capture are the environmental impacts of producing a particular good or service. And so we start out with a sort of inventory. So for example, in the case of dairy production, we have a tractor, so we actually had to dig up some iron ore out of the ground, and that goes into a category called non-renewable resource depletion. So you have a bunch of inventories, and then these sort of midpoints, how they actually affect sort of what category do they get put into. And then there's a normalization and weighting function to determine the relative importance of these different environmental impacts. So these are kind of the typical endpoints that an LCA looks at. And of course, the one we've been discussing and the one that is mostly discussed has to do with the issue of climate change. So in the case of dairy production, we are tracking CO2 and other greenhouse gases. That gets summed up into something called the global warming potential, which is expressed in CO2 equivalents emitted into the atmosphere. The ultimate endpoint is climate change, but the thing that we're reporting in our LCA are actually these midpoints, so we're reporting the global warming potential. We're not sort of directly saying this will result in a certain amount of climate change, a certain increase in the temperature of the Earth. We're reporting these midpoints in terms of global warming potential in the case of the climate change endpoint. There's also a number of other endpoints that can be included in an LCA, some of those having to do with human health. And so you see things up here like toxicity. So these would be things that are considered toxic that are released into the environment, or that humans come into contact when they're, say, working in a dairy plant. You know, there might be some toxics, although there are very few in a dairy plant. Other sorts of things that can affect human health or the quality of the ecosystem. So there's a whole list of midpoints and inventory items that we might consider when we look at ecosystem toxicity. These have to do with things like nutrient release into the environment, so nitrogen leaching or runoff, phosphorus runoff, that affect things like ecosystem quality. Resource depletion is probably the second most tracked impact in an LCA, and the one that's most commonly tracked, and the ones that we tracked were actually the use of energy in the system. And then there's a sort of an emerging field to look at cultural resources, and it's pretty rare to see this in an LCA, but I think it's really interesting, and we'll be actually talking a little bit about this when we get into discussing pasture-based dairying. For example, a dairy production system in the state of Wisconsin is sort of a cultural resource in that it provides the support for rural communities, and these rural communities develop a culture. And so, for example, if we change the way that milk is made in Wisconsin, if we already have changed it quite a lot from 60-cow single-family farms, increasingly looking at multi-thousand cow farms. That has changed the cultural landscape in Wisconsin. And so this is another sort of thing that can actually be tracked in an LCA. A consumer could, for example, have some information about a product that was produced in such a way that was culturally sensitive. Well, I just see a question here. Would phosphates be a mined non-renewable resource? The answer to that question is yes. So phosphates would actually would contribute both to this category. They would also contribute to this category, and this is sort of one of the complexities of an LCA. So we have an inventory that says, the phosphates are being applied to the land, so they have to be produced. So we want to take into account all of the processes that went into produce the phosphates. And so from that standpoint, it's a non-renewable resource depletion. But when it actually gets into the, is applied to the field, some of it can, the phosphorus can run off and contribute to ecosystem quality. So phosphates would actually have multiple arrows. And many of these inventory elements have multiple arrows. They contribute to different midpoints and different endpoints. Okay, so this is just an idea of how to sort of put these different environmental impacts into perspective, and this is one way to do it. And this is a system by which you can see there are a number of environmental impacts. We have climate change up here, ocean acidification, ozone depletion, sort of nutrient issues, nitrogen and phosphorus, freshwater use, land use, biodiversity loss. So in this particular analysis, there's a bunch of environmental impact indicators, and this green circle indicates a sort of a sustainability limit. So these sort of limits are very difficult to quantify, but these particular scientists took a stab at it and said, well, this is the level that's sort of a sustainable level. And then we sort of compare these different environmental impacts to their sustainable level. So in this case, I suspect these people were biologists. They're the worst environmental impact for this particular issue they were assessing was biodiversity loss. And you see it's many, many times beyond the sustainable level. So in the estimation of this group, the biggest environmental challenge facing the Earth is biodiversity loss. Sort of second of importance was the nitrogen cycle. Third was climate change, and then the other impact indicators are sort of still within the bounds of sustainability, so they are not as urgent or important. Another way to look at these trade-offs is to look at two different systems, and this is very typical. One system, in this case the yellow shape, versus the green shape. These are two different production systems. And so the yellow shape in this example has better economic performance. It has better energy performance, but in terms of biodiversity, soil, and air quality, it's worse. And in terms of water quality, it's the same. So this is a kind of another way to put these many different environmental impacts into perspective. And typically we do this when we're comparing one system to another. Okay, so let's kind of zoom in on dairy production. And one of the things we do when we do a life cycle assessment is we draw a system boundary. It's kind of hard to account for everything back to the creation of the world. So at some point you have to draw some boundaries, both in time and also in space. So for our analysis, we included crop production, milk production, transport of milk to the dairy plant, everything that happens at the processing plants, packaging, and then this is where we kind of stopped. So for this first analysis we'll look at, we are producing cheese, but we're really only taking it up to the dairy plant gate. So this would be called, in LCA terms, cradle to gate. So we're really going back to the cradle, to the very, beginning points of production, but we're only taking it up to the dairy plant gate. So in our analysis, we did not include the transportation issues to the retail and also the final consumption, what happens at the consumer end of things. This is the result now of just a carbon footprint. So this is, one slice of an LCA, and this is actually the study that was done by the DMI, Dairy Management Institute, or Dairy Research Institute, I guess they're called now. So I just want to take a little time to look at this and just remember again that we're looking at only the global warming potential. And part of that global warming potential is carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. So if you kind of look at these bars are direct emissions of carbon dioxide. There are also other greenhouse gases, and methane is an important one in dairy production systems. So this color, methane, is a major contributor in these parts of the production cycle. There's also N2O, and there are some N2O emissions in these parts of the production cycle. And then certain refrigerants also contribute to global warming. So over in the processing and retail, basically where things are refrigerated, you get some additional greenhouse. So let's just take a look, where are the big numbers? Where are the opportunities? So if you look at the biggest single source of greenhouse gas emissions from making milk, and this is actually just for making milk, it's enteric methane emissions. So that's the biggest single category, 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So next question is, so if we want to kind of reduce greenhouse gas emissions, this is one place where we might look. So anyone want to take a guess? You know, what's the potential to reduce enteric methane emissions? And this is quoted in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of milk produced. So what do you suppose, how much leverage do we have on reducing enteric methane? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Minor amount. I agree. Because, you know, enteric methane, you know, this is the process of rumination. It's really the fundamental biological process to convert grass into protein, into milk. So there are some opportunities, and in fact there's a big project going on to look at ways of reducing enteric methane, and Gene said better bacteria, you know, that's one strategy. There's some things you can do by adjusting the diet, you know, to try to reduce the amount of enteric methane. But, you know, in the final analysis, around about 0.5 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of milk, the amount of leverage we have here is, you know, probably relatively small. I'm just going to kind of guess that, you know, it might be 10%. So, you know, it's a big number, but our ability to change it is probably limited because it's such a fundamental biological process in making milk. So let's try another one. Actually, the next one is actually methane from manure management. So these are methane emissions. You know, we get some manure whether we like it or not, and then we got to do something with it. We can't let it pile up in the barn, so what we usually do is throw it in a pit, and it continues to be biologically active, and we get methane emissions from our manure storage, just like we get methane emissions from the rumen. So it's a big number. What's our leverage? Do we have some ability to deal with methane emissions from manure? Can we reduce that, and how? Yeah, we can cover the pits, so we can capture it, and then we got a huge balloon full of methane, and we can take one more step, and we can burn it. So if we just simply burn the methane, flare it, we're converting it from methane to carbon dioxide, and that actually does a good thing for us in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, because the potency of methane is about 25 times the potency of carbon dioxide for purposes of global warming. So if we just take this methane and convert it, we burn it, convert it into carbon dioxide, then we reduce this number by a factor of 25. So we got a lot of leverage there. Scott said anaerobic digestion. If we actually digest it, and instead of just burning it, we make electricity out of it, then we kind of get a double whammy, because we're avoiding the methane emissions, but we're also offsetting electric energy production, and we get a credit for that in the global warming potential category. So huge potential here. Kind of look at the other biggies, you know, carbon dioxide in the transportation, processing, and distribution. That's mainly from emissions from the energy used in the transport, processing, and distribution. So we have some leverage there to make those more efficient. Probably not big numbers. Same with retail. You know, that's refrigeration and you know, all the energy that goes into retail. Farm energy, if you look at farm energy, all the energy used on the farm is not a lot of energy. Well, I should say it's a fairly small amount of energy, but it's a very small part of greenhouse gas emissions. So going after making farms more energy efficient is going to have a pretty small impact on the carbon footprint of the dairy production system. Over here in the feed side, we've got some CO2 emissions. That's mainly from the tractors and so forth to produce the feed. We've also got some N2O emissions, which primarily has to do with nutrient use efficiency. So can we actually use our nutrients more efficiently? All right. So just kind of putting things in context there, the goal set up by the dairy industry is to reduce the carbon footprint, the greenhouse gas emissions, by 25% by the year 2020. This goal was actually established in 2007, so we're 5 years in to this goal, and we got 7 years to go. I don't think we're really getting close to this 25%. Partly because, it's a difficult thing to do, and also partly because the whole interest in reducing greenhouse gas emissions has kind of faded from the scene. I should say, one of the things that's really changed the landscape in the energy world is this, massive availability of natural gas because of fracking. So suddenly we have this enormous supply of very cheap fossil energy, and that makes it very, very, very difficult to try to promote a carbon reduction strategy or a renewable strategy or an energy efficiency strategy. So we'll see where that goes. So the DMI has a number of active projects. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But looking across the nation, if you look at sort of regional differences, here we are in Wisconsin, which is Region 3. And, we're not the lowest. Region 1 is actually the lowest, the northeast, lowest carbon footprint. The regions of the country that have the highest carbon footprint are Region 2, the southeast, and Region 4, the Central Plains. So based on sort of the way dairying is done in these regions, Wisconsin, the upper Midwest, looks pretty good. And the main reason for that is that we have very nice sort of compact nutrient cycling. We have a very efficient use. Our manure, the manure that comes out of the dairy barns in general goes back on land that's used to grow those dairy crops, and that's a very efficient nutrient use strategy. The other reason for that is that we have relatively little irrigation, so all the energy that goes into irrigating crops, doesn't get added onto our greenhouse gas ticket. So, I think we talked about this before already, the difficulty. The other thing that's sort of unique about the upper Midwest and Wisconsin in particular is that we have close location of a corn ethanol industry and a dairy industry. So this is something we sort of got interested in to say, is this a good deal? So is this sort of match between corn ethanol and dairy? Is it a good deal energy-wise? Is it a good deal carbon footprint-wise? Is it a good deal environmentally? So you can look at other parts of the world, like, for example, Iowa, where they have a bigger ethanol industry, but they have a much smaller dairy industry, although a lot of their distillers grains go into other types of animal feeds, primarily beef. You have that whole sort of Central Plains in California area of the country where they have dairy, but they don't have ethanol plants. So this is kind of a unique aspect of dairy production systems in the upper Midwest, this close proximity to between dairy production and distillers grains. So that's one of the things we got interested in. So what we did is we looked at 5 different dairy diets and tried to pick diets that, on the one hand, that were sort of representative of the way people are feeding dairy cows today, in particularly Wisconsin. And we also were sort of looking for differences in dairy diets that we thought might have substantial environmental consequences. So these are our 5 diets, and let's just take a minute to understand these acronyms. So we have 2 types of forage base. So we have alfalfa, and so if we're starting with an A, it means that our silage is primarily alfalfa. AS, so AS is alfalfa silage. The other system we have is corn silage. And so, we have the alfalfa group over here, we have the corn group over here, and then we have feeding of byproducts. So DG is distillers grains. So when you see a DG, it means we're maximizing the amount of distillers grains we're feeding to cows. And the amount of distillers grains you can feed depends on the silage. So, there's a very delicate balance in feeding a dairy cow. So if you look down here, if you maximize distillers grains in a corn silage diet, you can get about 4 kilograms of dry matter per day of distillers grains into a cow. If you're in a alfalfa diet, if you're using alfalfa forage, you can't feed as much distillers grains. So, this is sort of the interesting, complex part of this analysis is that it's really driven by the dairy diet. The dairy diet has to balance. It has to be an economic diet to feed the dairy cows. So again, alfalfa, AS, corn silage, CS, distillers grains is DG, and then we have soybean meal. We can also feed soybean meal. So here we try to diet with corn silage, but no distillers grains, just feeding some soybean meal. Same with the alfalfa. And then this first one here, CADS, is kind of the average of all of them. So we're using half corn silage, half alfalfa silage. We're feeding some soybean meal. We're feeding some distillers grains. So these sort of represent sort of extreme cases, and then this one represents sort of the middle ground. All right, so let's look at the numbers and see what happens. So if you look at, now here we're just looking at milk production, so we aren't actually taking it to cheese yet. This is actually the milk at the farm gate. So if we look at the 3 sort of environmental impacts that we were interested in, land use area, greenhouse gas emissions, and energy intensity, there wasn't a lot of difference in these different diets, sort of except for this one. So the diet where we maximized the distillers grains. So really the unique aspect here is we've got a diet that we're trying to pump as much distillers grains into a cow as we can. And what happens when we do that is we use more land because we are considering the ethanol plant as sort of really a feed processing center that just happens to be making ethanol. So for our purposes, from the standpoint of looking at it from a dairy farm, it's a feed processing center that's supplying us with distillers grains. And so we actually have to use more land to make the same amount of milk, because part of that land, this really like 18%, that's the land that's sort of devoted to ethanol production. The total greenhouse gas emissions go up. The energy intensity goes up because we have to put a lot of energy into the biorefinery. But in this analysis, we have not taken any credits. So we haven't taken any credits for the ethanol or in the case of a digester, for biogas. So if we actually start taking some credits, now we've just taken credit for the ethanol. So our system now has a co-product that produces ethanol, and if we say, well, wait a minute, actually if we can take a credit for the greenhouse gas emissions from that ethanol because they're not burning gasoline, then our greenhouse gas emissions in this system turn out to be the lowest. So taking the credit for the ethanol means that, environmentally speaking, from a big picture point of view, it's a good deal. So adding on a corn ethanol system integrated into a Wisconsin dairy system has the net effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions because we're producing a biofuel. The energy intensity also is the lowest. So from an energy point of view, the credit for the energy in the ethanol, makes it the most energy efficient system, because we are now actually producing some energy as part of the system. Sort of the environmental cost to that is that it costs us about 20% more land area, and that extra 20% is really the land that is now devoted to biofuels production. And in the practical case, what this really means for the state of Wisconsin is we export less corn. So we are a corn exporting state, and when we start making corn ethanol, what happens is we export less corn. We use more of that corn in state, and it becomes the basis for a energy production, a domestic within state energy production industry. The biggie is when we actually put digesters on all these farms, and there is a greenhouse gas reduction, which you can't really see on this slide because we're sort of basing it all here. So basically all of these farms have digesters. And so, it doesn't really affect the land area. The nutrient situation doesn't really change. The greenhouse gas emissions across the board are lower. But the big change here is that the energy intensity is negative, meaning now that these farms all are net energy producers. So you can see that the ethanol gave us a little bit of energy advantage, but the digester gives us an enormous, enormous energy advantage. So now instead of the milk production system being an energy user, it's a net energy producer, and that energy primarily is coming from the biogas. It's more than all of the energy, actually almost like 2 times more than all the energy that went into making the milk to start with. So huge energy implication, and it's a good deal, energy-wise, good deal from a carbon footprint standpoint. So these are just some finer analyses we did to look at, how we feed the distillers grains. Do we feed it wet? Do we feed it dry? How do we handle the manure? Is it injected or spread? How do we handle the manure storage, covered or uncovered? And then how do we use the energy? Do we put the biogas into a natural gas pipeline? Do we use it to generate electricity? Do we actually recover some of the heat? So these are just some finer point analyses to look at, again, opportunities to make the system more efficient. Where are the big differences across sort of common management practices that we might choose for a dairy production system? Same sort of thing with energy intensity. And you can see that what's good for greenhouse gas emissions is not necessarily the same things that are good for the energy point of view. So this gets back to that question of prioritizing, what's more important to the state of Wisconsin, energy independence or carbon footprint. We did an analysis of the effect of milk yield. There's been a couple studies that have looked at this, primarily studies looking at the use of BST and pasture-based dairying. And, we did see an effect of milk yield. So as you get more pounds per cow per day, your system looks more efficient. It's a fairly small effect. So it's not it doesn't approach the sort of effect of feeding distillers grains or putting an anaerobic digester. But there's a small effect on milk yield. So when we kind of back this up and look at our green cheese study, so this is our system sort of without distillers grains, without a digester. This is our system with distillers grains, but no digester, and this is our system with everything, the digester and the distillers grains. The U.S. average up here is 1.2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So even our best managed farms are better than the national average. And the farms that use, sort of the advanced technologies of distillers grains and digesters are considerably better. You have about half the carbon footprint of the national average, and considerably less than other parts of the world as well. But I want to just say a little bit about putting that into perspective. So when we looked at the average for Region 3 in that last graph, that's this red line. And the DMI study actually went out and surveyed a bunch of farms to see how they actually, their actual production practices, and then, to get an idea of how much variability there is out across different farms in terms of their carbon footprint. So this was the average for Region 3, and which is around 1 kilogram, just above 1, I think it's about 1.1. The very best farms were in here at about 0.6, 0.7. And then we had farms that were very high. So we had one farm that was 5.8, one farm that was 3.8, which didn't actually fit on the graph. They're way, way, way up here. But you can see, there's a bunch of farms up here. It's a very skewed distribution. This is the weighted average, weighted for milk production, the red line. So just the point I want to make here is that our green cheese model assumed that farms were using best management practices. Good nutrient management, good dairy nutrition, really best management practices, which puts our sort of green cheese model about here. So, a little bit better than the actual practice, and we kind of knew that because we modeled our farms to be really good farms. And then if we, added on these other things like distillers grains and digesters, that's what got us sort of down here. But the other sort of point of this is that there's tremendous, tremendous opportunities to reduce the carbon footprint, reduce the energy footprint of dairy production systems just by getting farms to establish and use best management practices. And that really comes down to good nutrient management, good dairy feeding. So you can kind of see here, you know, on the manure column, you know, this is all manure, so you can see it's a fairly sizable contributor, and there's lots of room for improvement here. The enteric print here, you know, it has primarily to do with the dairy nutrition part of things. So, you know, lots of room for improvement here. The feed print is, you know, these are field practices to just grow crops more efficiently. All right, so we also did an analysis of pasture-based dairying. And so very quickly here, we're going to get a little short on time, but the fundamental descriptor of a pasture-based system that we used is the percentage of dry matter intake, so the annual percentage of dry matter intake from pasture. And we did a range, you know, for as low as 5%. We talked to a lot of people who are doing pasture-based dairying, and about 30% was about as high as we could imagine getting for a pasture-based system in the upper Midwest. And, you know, of course, the reason for that is the pastures are productive for about 6 months out of the year. So during the summertime, these systems are actually getting about 60% of their dry matter from pasture, but during the winter they're getting 0. So the overall average is 30%. This 5% means that during the summertime, they're actually getting, you know, 10% of dry matter from pasture, and then none during the wintertime. And this scenario is sort of the minimum amount of dry matter from pasture that we consider to still be a pasture-based system. And B and C were sort of the maximum pasture, and then we had some sort of mid-pasture levels here. And F and G are just farms from our previous study. These are confinement operations, one without a digester and one with a digester. So the difference between B and C, these are sort of our maximized pasture, and one of the ways that you maximize pasture is you use a seasonal calving period. And, you know, what that does is reduce the nutritional requirements in the wintertime so that you don't have to feed as much non-pasture feed in the wintertime. So B and C are both seasonal, which is, you know, actually pretty rare to practice in this part of the world. But B uses highly productive land, and C uses sort of moderately productive land. So C is sort of, you know, a pasture system that we thought would be sort of suited to what might be called marginal lands, or, you know, lands that are on high slopes, lands that are, you know, have a higher erosion potential, generally less productive. So they're sort of might be uniquely suited to practice pasture on. So really it's kind of A, B, and C. You know, B and C being sort of extreme pasture, A being sort of minimal pasture, and then comparing to F and G, the conventional systems, with or without a digester. So the numbers are, if we look at the carbon footprint, not a lot of difference. So A, D, E, and F. So this is our conventional confinement system. You know, not a lot of difference across these. The really ultra pasture system with seasonal calving does have a lower carbon footprint. You know, a reduction from, you know, about maybe 10 to 20% reduction in the carbon footprint for a system that uses seasonal calving and maximizes dry matter from pasture. When we put the digester on the conventional farm, actually these are credits, so the total carbon footprint is actually going to be down here somewhere. So a conventional farm with a digester looks better than the pasture-based system. And, of course, one of the difficulties of a pasture-based system, these pasture-based systems would look a lot better if they had digesters, but of course digesters don't really lend themselves very well to pasture-based systems because you're trying to get the manure on the land, it's part of a nutrient management strategy. You don't have the opportunity to collect it. And you could collect the manure in the wintertime, for example, but the cost of doing that makes the digester less productive. So there's some real challenges to try to get a digester on a pasture-based system. If you look at it from an energy standpoint, again, the ultra-pasture systems have lower energy intensity, and the main reduction in the energy comes from the reduced energy to produce all the stuff that goes into making crops off the farm. So basically nitrogen, fertilizer, and all that jazz. So the thing that happens on the farm, there's some reduction there in the field. So if we compare our ultra-pasture system to a confinement system, there's a reduction in what happens in feed production on the farm, which is mainly, diesel fuel. There's some reduction as well in the off-farm feed inputs, which is mainly nitrogen fertilizer. It's not quite as big. But the dairy handling, the dairy herd part of things, which is, all the sort of electricity used to milk the cows and refrigerate the milk, not a lot of difference there, not a lot of opportunity to make these systems more efficient by looking at those sort of direct on-farm energy uses. And of course, again, the digester is the biggie. So putting the digester in turns this from an energy consumer into an energy producer and sort of swamps the energy numbers for the pasture-based systems. So just kind of in summary, as the percentage of dry matter from pasture goes up, greenhouse gas emissions go down, energy use goes down. Across the board, an anaerobic digester is the biggest single technology contribution to reducing both the greenhouse gas, the carbon footprint, as well as the energy intensity. The distiller's grains does use more land, but it does sort of make at least Wisconsin more energy independent. So we're using, like 10, 15, 20% more land as an energy resource. That means we have domestic energy production rather than imported energy production, so there's some economic benefits there as well. Still, lots and lots of opportunities to reduce environmental impacts just by using best management practices. So good nutrient management and good dairy herd management. The other thing we looked at, particularly in our pasture-based study, is we only looked at 3 environmental outcomes, but we know, like for pasture-based systems, there are a lot of other benefits. Reduced soil erosion, the potential for better nutrient efficiency, probably higher soil carbon content, which does kind of all sorts of good things for erosion and productivity. Perhaps better animal welfare. I work a lot with people who are interested in biodiversity. So, a pasture-based system will provide more diversity for insects, birds, small mammals. So there's all these other sort of impacts that we didn't quantify, sort of beyond what we were able to quantify. but we nevertheless recognize that they are important in environmental attributes. And the other thing that really came across to us is if you think of these sort of cultural resources, when we talked to people who did pasture-based dairying, we were very interested in, why did they choose to do this? And what they told us was that there were sort of rather substantial cultural benefits to them individually, to them as a group, and really to societies in general. In general, their view was that this way of producing milk had value not only to them in their sort of daily work lives, but also a value to society because it provided a more interesting and fulfilling rural environment. So beyond looking just at sort of the dollars and cents and the energy numbers and the carbon footprint, there is also a social ecosystem out there that is influenced by how we choose to, in this case, make milk. And something also that we sort of recognized was very important, but very difficult to quantify. So I think this last little bit goes into kind of the details of cheese and whey making. And I think it's probably too much detail. If you want to sort of go into it in more detail, we can do that. But I'll just sort of give you the summary. The typical cheese plant in Wisconsin, and really anywhere, particularly if it's a big cheese plant, dries the whey. So we were very interested in how you sort of account for this in a life cycle assessment, both for purposes of energy and for greenhouse gas emissions, because, again, it's very important to the state of Wisconsin, particularly, in the way in which this is presented. Sort of the burdens assigned to cheese are really interesting to us because we are such big cheese producers. So sort of the state of the art is to assess all of the burdens and benefits to the cheese, and if we happen to dry the whey, sort of anything extra we do to the whey gets assessed to the whey. So this is AM2 here, means that we're basically doing everything as we would have with no whey production, and then everything else we add on, particularly for the drying of the whey, gets assessed to the whey. And we kind of said, well, that's not exactly fair because there are a number of processes that occur in the making of the cheese that, the whey sort of gets the benefit of. Like, for example, pasteurizing the milk when it comes in the plant door. So do you assess that all to the milk or do you assess part of it to the whey? And we did this analysis and sort of recommended that the things, anything that contributed to the whey be assessed to the whey and sort of be credited on the cheese side. And the short answer is, that makes cheese look a little bit better. It makes whey look a little bit worse. So if we think more appropriately assigns the environmental burdens to the appropriate product. So if we didn't make whey, if we just put the whey on the field, then we could rightfully assess all the burden to the cheese. But if we're actually making whey, the cheese process in itself, in a sense, becomes more efficient because it's doing more than just making cheese. We're also making whey. On the other hand, the real energy-intensive part of this process is the whey. So, making dried whey is really energy-intensive. And similarly for carbon footprint, there's an enormous amount of emissions, primarily from the natural gas used to dry the whey, that should more appropriately be assessed to the whey rather than to the cheese. So again, that's kind of a real fine detail of our analysis. And I think with that, I'm going to stop talking and just sort of open it up for questions or comments. We had a comment here, make cheese on the farm and use the methane to dry the whey. That's a great idea. Except that a whey drying facility is a very, very expensive facility. So you tend to only see whey drying facilities on very large plants, or in smaller plants they might actually shift the whey to a whey drying facility. So any other questions, comments, observations?
Must be slow typers. Or you can get online and ask your question as well. Looks like we've answered all their questions.